From the Baker Institute for Public Policy at Rice University in Houston, Texas, this is Baker Briefing. I'm Joe Barnes. Baker Briefing tackles the most critical foreign and domestic policy issues of the day. Each episode is recorded at Rice University in Houston, Texas. Today's topic is the rule of law in Mexico. Last week, 4 U.S. citizens were kidnapped at gunpoint in northern Mexico. 2 were found dead and 2 were rescued after an intense manhunt. A drug cartel turned over a number of suspects. The incident has renewed U.S. focus on violence south of the border. The kidnapping quickly became an international incident. The FBI launched an investigation, the White House became involved, and some Republican members of Congress called for possible intervention in Mexico. To help us make sense of this event and the larger issues at play, I'm pleased to welcome Dr. Tony Payan. He directs the Center for the U.S. and Mexico at the Baker Institute, and I'm delighted to add, he is an old friend. Tony, thanks for being here.
Pleasure, Joe.
Could you give us a brief description of what exactly happened in northern Mexico?
Yeah, this is right across South Texas in Matamoros in the state of Tamaulipas in Mexico. 4 U.S. citizens traveled across the border. Their van had Carolina plates, and apparently they were simply going to prepare or get some sort of a cosmetic procedure. One of them at least, the other 3 were just accompanying that patient. And they found themselves in the street in the middle of a shootout between groups, apparently. That's the story. Of course, there's other hypotheses about what happened exactly, but the end result is that all 4 of them were picked up by the local gang. They were taken away. They disappeared. There was a search for them, as you mentioned. 2 of them were found dead. 2 of them were found alive later, one of them wounded. They were back in South Texas in the hospital. And then, of course, this initiated a big diplomatic and political incident between the 2 countries, which at the end of the day highlighted, in my view, the lack of collaboration on security issues between the 2 countries. Because, Joe, I want to emphasize 3 other women, U.S. citizens, disappeared as we speak past that incident. And this is only a few of hundreds of U.S. citizens who have gone missing over the years. So this is not a new incident. It just drew a lot of attention.
Well, look, this brings us to my next question, and it is an important one. What is the situation in terms of crime in Mexico?
Well, in the early 2000s, Mexico had a fairly low crime rate, almost comparable to that of the United States. In the U.S., we have a murder rate of 5.5 over 100,000. In Mexico, at that time, it was about 7 over 100,000. And today, Mexico is closer to 28 or 29, so it's almost sextupled since the early 2000s. Of course, they blame President Calderon, who was the president of Mexico between 2006 and 2012, for having confronted organized crime openly and aggressively through a collaborative framework between the 2 countries known as the Mérida Initiative, signed by both presidents, Calderon and Bush, back in 2007, and which stayed in place until about 3 years ago. At that time, of course, violence and criminal gang activity in Mexico spiked when López Obrador took office at the end of 2018.
Now, people routinely refer to him as AMLO, his initials, right?
That is correct, AMLO. I usually refer to him as López Obrador, President López Obrador, or AMLO. In 2018, 2019, he decided that he was not going to confront organized crime openly in Mexico the way Mr. Calderon had done before him, and he pronounced that his new strategy was something known as abrazos no balazos, hugs not bullets. In other words, non-confrontation with organized crime, in the hopes that non-confrontation would lead to them standing down and, of course, a reduction in crime and violence. Clearly, that has not happened. Mexico has stayed at a very high level of crime and violence, and now I am afraid there are many more groups that are organized and conducting all kinds of illegal activities throughout Mexico, almost in every single state, and of course, a general deterioration of the rule of law in Mexico. So the president, 1, didn't confront organized crime, didn't want to, and number 2, his promise that he would bring down crime and violence didn't work, as Mexico continues to experience these high waves of both.
So the hard line didn't work and the soft line didn't work.
Correct. And this is what I think is a problem from hell. What do? If you confront organized crime, you are going to generate a reaction from these gangs. They're going to fire back. A lot of people are going to get caught in the crossfire, a lot of innocent people, as we saw between 2006 and 2012. And of course, if you don't confront them, then you're giving them a carte blanche, and they're going to run around the country. They're going to regroup. They're going to gain strength, much like a hurricane in warm weather, so to speak, and they're going to expand their activities and their territorial control. Plenty of American politicians today are saying that there are vast swaths of land in Mexico that are fully controlled by organized crime, even if Mr. López Obrador denies it.
You've mentioned U.S. lawmakers, and what we've seen in the wake of the kidnappings and the murders has been a lot of talk on Capitol Hill, particularly from Republicans. I think Senator Lindsey Graham has suggested that the Mexican drug cartels be labeled foreign terrorist groups. I think there's even some suggestions or implied statements that the United States should intervene militarily in Mexico. What do you make of these statements, and how do you assess what the United States will really do?
This is a very complicated question. It's got several important points to it. Number one is whether these organizations, criminal organizations in Mexico, are terrorist organizations. Terrorism is generally defined as something that has a political purpose, that has political intentions. They want to overthrow the regime, they want to interfere with the politics in the country and such. For a long time, we thought that organized crime in Mexico was essentially a criminal economic enterprise. They had no political intentions. However, there are very strong rumors and emerging evidence that organized crime has actually participated in Mexico's elections under the López Obrador administration. They have kidnapped poll workers. They have intimidated candidates. They have actively supported and even financed campaigns by AMLO's political party, Morena, in different states in exchange for being allowed to conduct their criminal activities throughout the country. So there seems to be some sort of Pax Mafiosa agreement in Mexico between the government and these criminal groups. And of course, what Senator Menendez from New Jersey and of course Lindsey Graham from South Carolina are pointing out is, I think, the fact that the Mexican government seems to have this kind of tacit, if not explicit, agreement with organized crime, and there's a lot of frustration in the U.S. because, Joe, in 2021 we had 107,000 overdoses by fentanyl, and almost all fentanyl is coming from Mexico. So there's this degree of frustration from our political class in the United States. However, I think it's a lot of political posturing too. I don't think they're terrorist organizations, and I think it would be a grave mistake that would compromise the entire binational relationship if they were to be designated that, and if the U.S. decided to go unilaterally after these groups.
Once again, you've led me to the next obvious question, which is, could you put the current crisis over violence in Mexico and drug use in the United States into the broader context of U.S.-Mexican relations under Joe Biden?
Yes, look, one of the most interesting hypotheses that I've been exploring in the last few weeks, perhaps 3 months or so, is the idea that Mr. López Obrador, who is a very astute political figure, has actually found a card that is very useful in neutralizing almost any political pressure from the United States on a number of issues, from the rather lax implementation of the USMCA to drug trafficking to the United States and other important issues to the United States in exchange for controlling immigration. So Mr. López Obrador has handled the immigration card and played it very well, and both Trump and the Biden administration have been very concerned about these waves of immigrants, asylum seekers transiting through Mexico up to the U.S.-Mexico border, and in exchange for Mr. López Obrador's help, they've simply let up on a lot of other issues. So I think Washington has a political problem. They haven't found exactly where the edge of this problem is and how they can engage Mexico on a more comprehensive set of issues, put all the issues on the table and deal with all of them at once, including this very important thing that is going on in Mexico, which is organized crime. By the way, Americans are affected by organized crime. Fentanyl is one example. Kidnappings of Americans in Mexico is another example. But of course, we also have to know that Mexicans are affected because these criminal groups are not just drug traffickers. They are kidnapping Mexicans, extorting money from businesses, assaulting people and robbing people on highways in Mexico, stealing natural resources, tapping into the pipelines of fuel in Mexico, and on and on. So criminal activities in Mexico today are many, and they're all over the place, and many Mexicans are living under what I think is a broken social contract. And so I think this is an opportunity for the United States to really find a way to engage Mexico at the table and say everything should be on the table. Immigration, trade, investment, citizen protection, border management, and also drug trafficking.
The question I always ask when we hear calls for broad-based discussions, how do we get there from here?
Well, I think at the end of the day, Mr. López Obrador is beginning to feel the heat. Look, this incident in Matamoros, which we spoke about at the beginning of the podcast, was very important because it really began to resonate throughout the US media. A lot of Americans began to pay attention. There were some serious warnings about not visiting Mexico. 40 million tourists, most of them Americans, travel to Mexico every single year. This is about the third most important source of revenue for Mexico, after, of course, some activities of the USMCA and remittances from Mexican immigrants in the United States, that money that's sent to Mexico. Tourism comes next, and that's a really important source. And so Mexico depends on this tourism. And of course, there's now voices on Capitol Hill from both sides of the aisle, Democrats and Republicans, calling for direct action. And there's increasing pressure from Ambassador Salazar, the U.S. ambassador in Mexico, to pay attention to this issue and to tackle organized crime. And I think Mr. López Obrador is beginning to lose something that he's never really lost before, which is the initiative in the day-to-day discourse. Whatever the media is going to talk about, he sets in his morning conferences, in the press conference that he holds every single day, Monday through Friday. And this is the first time that the United States has had an opportunity to put pressure on Mr. López Obrador. He's having to respond, and I think it's a good opportunity to say, hey, let's talk, but let's talk about everything.
Tony, I can't thank you enough for coming to talk to us. As always, you're remarkably well informed, and you have that special ability that is not universal in academics to make the complex a bit clearer.
Glad to be here, Joe. It's a pleasure.
Baker Briefing is brought to you by the team at the Baker Institute for Public Policy. This episode was produced by Victoria Jupp and Shannon Moriarty. AV production was led by Kevin Young. Many thanks to the Baker Institute production interns who assisted with this episode: Maya Adhikari, Sarah Davidson, and Liza Jacob. The Baker Institute for Public Policy provides meaningful policy analysis on the most critical challenges facing Texas, the United States, and the world. It is a nonprofit, nonpartisan policy research organization based in Houston. To learn more, including how you can attend a live podcast recording on the campus of Rice University, visit us at bakerinstitute.org. Thank you for listening.